Hey listeners, this is the English adaptation of Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador. Para español, vuelva al feed y selecciona el título en español. Join the conversation on social media by tagging at This Is Sonoro. The episode you're about to listen to contains descriptions of physical violence and stories of victims of disappearance. Listener discretion is advised. It's a hot and humid day in June. Reporter Bryan is driving to meet with Daisy Aguirre, who we met in the last episode. It had been a few weeks since Factum had published the alleged killer's confession, and since the government had ordered them to take it down. But the Factum reporters were determined to keep reporting on the case, so Bryan set out to meet Daisy.
Entonces ella me dijo que sí, que aceptaba que llegara a su casa y me dio su dirección. Y pues nada, una tarde me fui a su casa.
Bryan greets Daisy at the entrance of her house, where she also has a small business selling clothes and accessories. They start talking, and they talk for hours, discussing the details surrounding her daughter's disappearance. In the end, Daisy tells Bryan that she read Factum's article, and she thinks Bryan has more information on Rina's death. She wants to know the whole truth. Bryan is taken aback by the statement. By now, he has gone deeper in his own investigation of the Chalchuapa murders, and he does know more. But he's hesitant to tell her. The details of the alleged murderer's modus operandi are gruesome. Bryan is concerned about how she'll react. He explains that what he has learned in his reporting could be shocking for her, for anyone to hear, and that he's still investigating some of the details in the confession that might not even be accurate. Still, Daisy insists.
Yo quería saber qué era lo que había pasado con mi hija. Y por muy fuerte que fuera, pero que si yo de eso me iba a morir, no importaba. Yo iba satisfecha de saber la verdad.
She's willing to listen, as awful as it may be, to know the truth about what happened to her daughter. My name is Daniel Alvarenga. I'm a Salvadoran-American journalist. Join me and hear how the discovery of a mass grave in El Salvador uncovered a crisis of violence and corruption, reaching up to the highest levels of government. It's a crisis that I followed from afar, but that ended up touching close to home. For Sonoro Media, in collaboration with Revista Factum, this is Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador. Episode 3, Silence and Censorship. After the government censored the confession, the reporters at Factum lived with a constant sense of dread. Sources had warned they could be detained. This wasn't the first time Bryan had come into the government's crosshairs. He'd faced threats while reporting on another sensitive case a few years prior. With a colleague, he uncovered a secret squadron operating within the National Police. Created under the previous president, this squadron was attacking, extorting, and even killing people they claimed were gang members. A de facto death squad, operating with impunity. It's nothing new, but part of a long history of state-sponsored violence and murder. Bryan's reporting also highlighted the dangers of gang association in El Salvador. The government has long utilized, weaponized public opinion by leveraging charges of gang affiliation against its opponents. When Factum published this earlier report on the National Police, Bryan and his colleagues faced online harassment for months. Nearly all journalists deal with this nowadays. Twitter threats and Facebook attacks are, sadly, just part of the job. Even more so for anyone covering the Bukele administration. With even the most benign coverage, I regularly spark the wrath of pro-Bukele accounts. This army of trolls is a virulent group, standing at the ready to respond to any mention of their beloved president. Still, it reached a new level when the director of the police academy joined in and singled out Bryan by name.
y uno que se llama, creo que Bryan, que según información de la policía, él está relacionado porque tiene un hermano pandillero preso.
He alleged that police accounts proved that Bryan had gang ties through his brother. He never presented said accounts, but he said that's why Bryan was covering this story. There was just one major issue with this claim. Bryan doesn't have a brother. It didn't matter. After the interview, the barrage of threats and intimidation he'd faced moved offline. Bryan was followed by unmarked cars. Plainclothes officers showed up at his office. Even the most veteran reporters at Factum started to worry.
Llegaron a nuestra oficina, se hacían pasar por procuradores de derechos humanos. Obviamente no se les abrió nunca la puerta, pero nos vigilaban, empezaron a darnos seguimiento.
That's Factum reporter Fernando Romero. He recalls being followed and surveilled by intelligence officers from Aguirre, El Salvador's version of the CIA. It seemed like Factum and its reporters had been named personas non gratas.
Y desde entonces somos como personas a las que hay que darle seguimiento, porque podemos estar averiguando cosas que no les gusta a nadie en el poder.
Still, the Factum team had faith that better forces in the government would prevail. Some of the accused policemen were arrested after the Death Squad report was published. Even the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, an independent arm of the Organization of American States dedicated to investigating human rights abuses in the region, issued a recommendation to the Salvadoran government to protect Bryan and his colleagues from the active threats and harassment they were facing. The threats continued for a few weeks after, but then, suddenly, they just stopped. The crisis was over. But in 2021, it was different. Factum had faced threats before, but this was the first time they'd been censored. The first time they were silenced through legal means. The order came from a court, so there wasn't an institution that would address Factum's claims or defend their rights. Nobody was going to protect the press this time. It seemed like the government was hell-bent on keeping the Chalchuapa case from getting any bigger. And Bryan kept asking himself, why? Why were they determined to keep this buried? And who else were they silencing? Israel Ticas is a forensic criminologist in El Salvador. We met him briefly in episode 1. For the past 33 years, he's been going to the most gruesome crime scenes to piece together what's happened. With the discovery of the Chalchuapa grave, Ticas was called onto the scene.
Yo tengo casi 33 años de ser forense y puedo decirle que nunca había visto una escena así.
He was shocked by what he found in Chalchuapa. In all the years on the job, he hadn't seen anything like this. He took stock of the scene. The body count kept growing from 10 to 12 to 14. Some of the corpses were fresh. Others had been there for months. Ticas was a long-time, trusted source for journalists in El Salvador. He and Bryan had developed a rapport, a mutual respect. Bryan knew Ticas would give him the access and information he needed for his stories. He had even allowed Bryan to accompany him to other crime scenes. But with Chalchuapa, that changed. Ticas stopped giving updates to the press. He refused to share information on how the excavation was going. Bryan had known Ticas for years. He knew this was completely out of character, but Ticas was adamant. No one was forcing his silence.
Y referente a la información que anda a circular, de que se está restringiendo la información a los medios de comunicación, siento que eso es totalmente falso.
As part of the investigations conducted for this podcast, we reached out to Ticas again for comment, but he didn't respond. And while Ticas maintained that nobody was keeping him quiet, the government was telling a different story. Officials organized a press conference just a few miles down the road from the site of the mass grave. The Attorney General took the stand.
Lo que sí censuro es que un empleado de la Fiscalía.
He told the media that a member of his office was facing disciplinary action. He didn't name Ticas, but he didn't have to. A key member of the investigation was facing disciplinary action for granting interviews to the press. Once again, the government was pushing to be the only voice on the case. With the government in control of the narrative, families were getting little to no information about their missing loved ones. Daisy and others started looking for the truth on their own. On that hot, humid June afternoon, Bryan sat in Daisy's living room faced with a choice. Should he share his reporting on the case with Daisy? Grisly details and all? His stomach churned as he sat in a small plastic chair beside an enormous framed photo of Rina. It's from her quince, just a year before, and she's dressed up and smiling broadly at the camera, sitting beside this photo of Daisy's missing daughter. Bryan is not sure what he will do, what he should do. For now, he focuses on Daisy, who has settled beside him with 2 glasses of water. She's ready to talk about Rina. Rina left home on March 28, 2021. As we learned in the previous episode, she'd been approached by Hugo Osorio about a prospective job selling cell phones at a new kiosk in Metro Centro, the local mall. The plan was to meet him that morning. Daisy remembers Rina being worried about getting there on time. She said goodbye to her daughter with a kiss, and off she went. For Daisy, the rest of the morning passed as usual. Rina was due home that afternoon. When she didn't show, Daisy gave her daughter a call.
Nosotros le hablábamos por teléfono y al teléfono no lo contestó, ya estaba apagado. Y ahí fue donde nosotros ya nos pusimos a ver qué es lo que pasaba, que no sabíamos nada de ella.
Daisy called and called, but Rina's phone was shut off. That's when she really started to worry. Daisy went out to look for Rina. She recruited her eldest daughter and a friend to help. At 7 p.m., Daisy's search party took a taxi to Metro Centro, the mall where Rina had supposedly gone to work.
Y empezamos a investigar que si había un local de venta de celulares nuevo. Con los vigilantes de ahí de Metrocentro, ellos dijeron que no había ningún local, que no habían inaugurado nada.
She asked around, seeing if any vendors knew where the new cell phone kiosk was, but they all said the same thing. There weren't any new kiosks. Daisy was baffled. She left the mall in a state of shock and confusion. What had happened to her daughter? Rina was a very responsible young woman. She and Daisy were close. There was no reason for her to lie. None of this made sense. Something was wrong. Daisy could feel it. When she finally got home later that night, Daisy felt truly devastated. It was the first of many nights that she would spend not knowing what had happened to her daughter. The next morning, Daisy's oldest daughter posted a photo of her sister on Facebook, asking for help to find her. The following is a translation and reenactment by an actress.
I need your help to find my sister, Rina Graciela Aguirre Anaya, 16 years old, who went to work from her house in Ciudad Real yesterday, Sunday, March 28th. We haven't known her whereabouts since 10 a.m.
Daisy, meanwhile, went to file a missing persons report. She was hoping the police could help. Instead, they leveled accusations at her, blamed her for the disappearance of her 16-year-old daughter.
Señora, ¿usted sabe que pedir presa por eso? ¿Por qué? Porque la niña es menor de edad. ¿Y usted le dio permiso a trabajar? Sí, yo le di. Puede ir presa usted y su papá de la niña, me dijo.
The police asked Daisy why she'd given Rina permission to work. They threatened to put her in jail for doing so. I should note here that it's extremely common for teenagers to have jobs in El Salvador, as it is in many parts of the US. Finally, after a lot of back and forth, the police reluctantly took down Daisy's information and filed the report. Daisy was sent home. She was told if there were any updates, someone from the police would contact her.
Me llegaban a las 12 de la noche y una ventana esperándola. Amanecí el siguiente día, la esperábamos en el día, no regresaba, llegaba la noche, la siguiente noche, volvía a hacer lo mismo.
Days passed. Daisy's telephone never rang. No updates, no news. Daisy spent her nights sitting by the window, waiting and hoping for her daughter's return. And she continued searching. With her eldest daughter, she kept sharing Rina's photo on social media. A month and a half after her child disappeared, Daisy received a call. But it wasn't the police. It was her landlord. He wanted to know if Daisy had heard what was happening in Chalchuapa.
Me dice, niña Daisy, ¿se da cuenta de lo que está pasando aquí en Chalchuapa? Yo no sé nada, le dije. Me dijo, tráigase una foto de la niña y véngase. Me dijo que a ver si no ahí aparece su hija.
May 2021. The news of the mass grave had broken. And Daisy's landlord noted, maybe it was a lead. Maybe Rina was there. Daisy hung up the phone. In her heart, she didn't feel fear. She felt hope. The hope that maybe, after months of uncertainty, she would finally know what happened to Rina. She made calls about the case and managed to connect with the district attorney's office. They put the lead DA on the line.
Me dijo de que ahí solo habían 2 muertos y que no me preocupara porque mi hija no estaba ahí. Algo molesta, porque sí me lo dijo bien molesta.
The aggravated DA told Daisy that only 2 bodies had been found in Chalchuapa, not to worry, because Rina wasn't there. But as the investigation into Chalchuapa progressed, Daisy started getting contradictory reports. Days after being told there were only 2 bodies, the official story changed. The authorities announced that there were more bodies buried. They asked Daisy to come to the gravesite. Then, as she was about to leave, they called to say that it was no longer necessary. They would come to her. Officers came to Daisy's home, took a statement, and left. They didn't answer any of her questions. They didn't have any new information for her. Daisy was fed up. After weeks of silence, the police called her again and asked her once more to visit the scene. She grabbed her keys, her phone, and a picture of Rina. With her eldest daughter, she set out for Chalchuapa, determined to get answers, determined to get the truth.
Yo quería saber la verdad, si estaba mi hija y lo que yo iba pensando es que yo les quería pedir las evidencias de la ropa que andaba mi hija.
They got a car to drive them as close to the scene of the crime as possible. They walked the rest of the way. As she approached Estevez Alley, Daisy spotted yellow caution tape blocking off the street. Forensic specialists, police, and detectives were everywhere, crossing between the gravesite and emergency vehicles. Daisy ducked under the yellow police tape and approached house number 11. But before she could enter the house, someone stopped her. It was the lead criminologist on the case, Israel Ticas.
Pues luego nos salió a encontrar el señor Ticas y nos pasó adelante. Allá luego salió una fiscal, me pidió foto de Rina y se pusieron a ver la foto y se voltearon a ver ellos.
Ticas was followed by a prosecutor. They asked Daisy for a photo of Rina. Ticas and the state prosecutor exchanged a look. Daisy took it as a sign.
Le digo, mi corazón me decía que sí, mi hija estaba ahí.
Daisy's heart was telling her, yes, this is where her daughter might be buried. But Ticas and the prosecutor didn't confirm anything. Once again, Daisy was sent home empty-handed, condemned to sit and wait by the window, hoping that her daughter might one day return home, or at least that somebody would return her call. 2 more months passed. No news. Then, in June 2021, the phone finally rang. The state's forensic team wanted her to do a DNA test. Daisy showed up the next day. Nobody explained why they needed the DNA. A clerk simply took a sample and sent her on her way. A month later, Daisy got another call. It was a new request that she speak with the social worker. Daisy thought it was weird. Nobody would confirm they'd found her missing daughter, but they were offering her therapy sessions with the social worker. She was hesitant at first. Did the state think she was crazy? Daisy's heart hurt for her missing daughter, but her head, it was clear. She knew what she needed. Answers.
Yo decía, ¿para qué voy a ir a una terapia con un psicólogo si no estoy ni loca? Si yo lo que estoy es dañada de mi corazón, no dañada de mi cabeza.
Still, Daisy's sister encouraged her to try it. She said it would help.
Entonces, en eso mi hermana me dijo, no, Daisy, me dijo, tenés que ir a las terapias, me dijo. Te va a ayudar mucho eso. Entonces, contra mi gusto, pero sí me presenté a la primera terapia, ¿verdad? De ahí fui a la segunda.
So Daisy finally agreed. The government gave her a total of 3 30-minute therapy sessions about loss and grief. And still, no answers. On August 27th, the authorities asked her to come in again. This time, it wasn't for therapy. Instead, she was taken to a room to meet with a prosecutor, a social worker, and a psychologist. 5 months after her daughter disappeared, she finally knew where Rina was.
Pues me puse mal porque uno todavía tenía la esperanza, ¿verdad? Que todavía tal vez podía estar viva mi hija. Y le dicen a uno, no, pues el examen está positivo.
Daisy was devastated. She'd been holding out hope, some hope, that Rina might be alive. But now, that little bit of hope was crushed. Rina was dead. It was official. Her body had been found in a mass grave in Chalchuapa. What Daisy didn't know was that it had been more than 100 days since the prosecutor's office put Rina's name on a list of possible Chalchuapa victims. They did this because the alleged killer had specifically mentioned Rina in his confession. At the end of the meeting, the authorities said they'd notify her when she could come get Rina's remains. They warned that it could take a while. It took 41 days. Daisy was asked to come down to the forensic offices to be presented with Rina's remains. In total, it had been more than half a year since her daughter had disappeared. She was ushered into a room along with other families, all there to receive the remains of a loved one. There were 12 cardboard boxes lined up in a row. Daisy's was box number 1. Daisy was presented with the box. The officials explained that the delay was because multiple bodies had been found in the grave. Determining which victim each of the bones belonged to was difficult. Daisy asked the medical examiner to open the box. She wanted to see her daughter one more time.
Sí, pero yo quiero ver a mi hija, porque solo aquí la va a ver, me dijo. Ya en su casa ya no puede, es prohibido, man. Va sellada ya.
The medical examiner initially refused. He said Daisy was too anxious. But Daisy had been told that this was her only chance to see Rina's remains. They would seal the box before handing it over to her. Opening it at home was prohibited. So she insisted. He must open the box.
Sí, destápemela que la quiero ver, le dije. Entonces vino el doctor, la destapó. Y luego la vimos, los huesitos.
Finally, the truth. Daisy looked down and saw what was left of her daughter. Bryan listened to Daisy's saga while sitting in the little chair in her living room. After she finished, they sat in silence for a while. All around her home, Daisy had little reminders of Rina. Next to where she sat was an altar full of saint figurines. Beneath it, the huge photograph of Rina at 15 years old. Bryan looked at it again as they sat there, not saying a word.
Daisy merecía saber la verdad. Decidí hacer lo único en mi poder para que así fuera.
Daisy deserved to know the truth.
Tomé el
Bryan
celular de
took
mi
a deep
bolsillo
breath and
y
told
abrí el
Daisy what he
documento
knew,
con la
some of
confesión.
the details that you listened to
Lo
in the
leímos
last
juntos,
episode, which is
murmurando el
what he'd
texto
found
entre
so
dientes.
far in his reporting. Bryan watched Daisy's face change through the conversation. When they were done, Daisy sat silently. Her eyes were fixed on the photo of her daughter in the corner. Finally, she turned to Bryan and thanked him for telling her all of this.
Entonces mi corazón quedó contento de saber qué había pasado con mi hija.
To finally know the story that the authorities were still keeping from her.
Si no hubieran periodistas, no saliera a luz todo lo que está pasando, todo quedaría oculto.
Without Bryan, without journalists, she added, this wouldn't have come to light. The truth would have stayed hidden from her and those who needed it the most. The government of El Salvador has continued to treat the Chalchuapa case with secrecy and silence. To this day, as we record this podcast, there's no official update on the total number of bodies that were found there. While Daisy's story is heartbreaking, it's not uncommon. All over the country, those with missing loved ones are forced to search alone. Often with little to no help from the authorities, day after day, they are met with silence. Their only option is to go out on their own. Daisy isn't the only person who came to Esteves Alley looking for a missing loved one. As the story of the mass grave grew, hundreds of families arrived to look for their missing loved ones. It was like a magnet. Many had been searching for years. Paradoxically, the gravesite became a symbol of hope. The hope of finally getting an answer.
Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador is a Sonoro original series, in collaboration with Revista Factum. This episode was produced by Fernanda Estrada and Hannah Bottom, with the help of Sara Mota. Written by Fernanda Estrada and Bryan Avelar. Adaptation by Hannah Bottom and Tasha Sandoval. Hosted by Daniel Alvarenga. Edited by Rodrigo Crespo and Nick Milanes. The managing editor was Rodrigo Crespo. Reporting by Bryan Avelar, Fernando Romero, and Gerson Nájera. Factum's team coordination and editorial consulting by Horus Villacorta. Fact-checking by Evelyn Uribe. Tape sync by Gerson Nájera and Marvin Siliesar. Mix and sound design by Fernando Galaviz. Original music by Laura Cruz and Héctor Fernández. Executive producers Jasmine Romero, Camila Victoriano, Jerónimo Ávila, and Joshua Weinstein. Thanks to Alessia Genovese for archival tape. And thanks to Alfaro for allowing us to use their interview material.